I knew my neighbor Karen had it out for me, but I never thought she'd go this far. I stepped out of my house that morning, coffee in hand, ready to grab my mail, but something was wrong. I stared at the empty patch of ground where my mailbox had stood the day before. No post, no box, just a hole in the dirt. I set my mug down on the porch railing and took a deep breath. "Are you kidding me?" I muttered. I already knew who had done it. Karren. The self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the HOA president, and my own personal headache. She had been on my case ever since I moved in last year. First, it was complaints about my grass not being the exact shade of green she preferred. Then, it was passive-aggressive notes about my trash cans being too visible from the street. And now, she had escalated to outright vandalism. I stormed over to her house, knocking firmly on her door. It swung open almost immediately, as if she had been expecting me. Karren stood there with her arms crossed, wearing that smug expression she always had when she thought she had won. She was in her mid-50s, her hair perfectly styled like she had just walked out of a salon, and her expression screamed superiority. "Can I help you, Elijah?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You know exactly why I'm here," I said, pointing toward the empty spot where my mailbox used to be. "Where is it?" Karren let out a theatrical sigh, shaking her head. "Oh, that old thing. It was non-compliant with HOA regulations. I had it removed." Non-compliant. "It was the same as everyone else's," she shrugged. "The HOA has certain aesthetic standards. Yours was outdated. I was doing you a favor, really." I clenched my jaw. "You didn't even give me a warning." "Oh, Elijah," she said, tilting her head in mock sympathy. "The HOA has the right to enforce rules as needed." I knew that was a blatant lie. Even if there had been a legitimate violation, she would have been required to send me a written notice and give me time to correct it. Instead, she had taken matters into her own hands. I took a step closer. "I want my mailbox back." Karren's smile widened. "Oh, it's gone, disposed of, but don't worry, you're free to install a new one after you submit a request for approval, of course." I could feel my blood boiling. She wanted me to jump through hoops just to do something I was legally allowed to do. I stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, Karren, if that's how you want to play it." I turned on my heel and walked away, ignoring the satisfied look on her face. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What she didn't know was that I had been planning something for weeks, something that was about to make her life very uncomfortable. Because in less than 24 hours, the HOA was holding elections, and I had made sure my name was on the ballot. Elijah didn't waste any time. After his exchange with Karren, he walked straight back to his house, pulled out his laptop, and opened the neighborhood forum. He had been quiet on there for months, biding his time, watching how the HOA operated. He had seen the complaints stack up, residents frustrated with unjust fines, arbitrary rule changes, and Karren's blatant favoritism. The problem was, most people felt powerless to do anything about it. That was about to change. Elijah typed out a message, keeping it short and to the point. He reminded everyone that the HOA elections were scheduled for the following evening and encouraged them to show up and vote. He didn't mention Karren directly, but he didn't need to. Everyone already knew who was responsible for the majority of their frustrations. Within minutes, the post was flooded with comments. "Finally, someone willing to take her on," one neighbor wrote. "She fined me last year because my garden gnome was too whimsical. This woman has to go," another added. Elijah grinned. The momentum was already shifting. The next morning, he took another step to ensure his win. He printed out flyers with the details of the election and a short message about why he was running. Then he spent the day knocking on doors, speaking with neighbors face to face. Most people were eager to talk. They were tired of Karren's iron grip on the community. Some had been hit with ridiculous fines for minor infractions. Others had been denied basic home improvements for arbitrary reasons. One elderly couple told Elijah that Karren had pressured them to repaint their house 3 times in 2 years because she didn't like the shade. By the time the election meeting rolled around, Elijah knew he had the numbers to win. The HOA held their meetings at the community center, a dull beige building that Karren had insisted be repainted last year using HOA funds without consulting the residents, of course. The turnout that night was higher than any previous election. Normally, these meetings were poorly attended, allowing Karren to maintain control with little resistance. But tonight, nearly everyone in the neighborhood had shown up. Karren sat at the front, her usual air of superiority intact. She clearly hadn't anticipated this level of attendance. Elijah took his seat near the front, arms crossed, watching as Karren called the meeting to order. She breezed through the usual agenda points, trying to appear unfazed. But Elijah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tapped impatiently on the table. Then they reached the election portion of the meeting. "As you all know, we are here to elect the HOA president," Karren announced, forcing a smile. "I am, of course, running for re-election. If there are any other nominees, please step forward now." Elijah stood without hesitation. The room buzzed as he walked down the aisle, stopping beside Karren at the front. "I'm running," he said simply. Karren let out a short laugh, but it was too loud, too forced. "Elijah, dear, being HOA president is a serious responsibility. It's not for everyone." Elijah met her gaze steadily. "I know exactly what it entails, and I'm ready for it." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Karren's usual tactics weren't working tonight. She attempted to regain control. "Well, we certainly welcome democratic participation," she said through gritted teeth. "We'll let the community decide." The voting process was straightforward. Each household got one vote, written anonymously on slips of paper. The ballots were collected and counted in front of everyone to ensure fairness. Karren's confidence began to crack as the count went on. The HOA secretary, a timid woman who had clearly endured years of Karren's dominance, hesitated before reading the final tally. "Elijah wins," she announced. For a moment the room was silent. Then the applause erupted. Karren stood frozen, her face pale. That can't be right," she stammered. "It's right," Elijah said. "And as of now, I'm the new HOA president." Karren's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time, she was speechless. Elijah turned to the crowd. "Changes are coming," he said, "starting with transparency and fairness." The cheers grew louder. Karren, still reeling, stormed out of the room. Elijah watched her go, knowing this wasn't the end. Karren wouldn't go down without a fight, but he was ready for whatever she threw next. Elijah didn't have time to celebrate his victory. The moment the meeting ended, people swarmed him, eager to voice their frustrations. They wanted answers. They wanted change. And most of all, they wanted to know what he planned to do about Karren's reign of terror. He listened carefully, taking mental notes as residents shared their grievances. Some were minor annoyances, like unnecessary letters about lawn decorations. Others were more serious unjust fines, threats of liens, and even rumors that Karren had been mishandling HOA funds. By the time he left the community center, it was clear that this wasn't just about a power-hungry HOA president. Karren had been running the association like her personal kingdom for years, and no one had been able to stop her. Until now. Elijah knew she wouldn't take her loss gracefully. He was proven right when he arrived home to find a fresh violation notice taped to his door. The ink was still drying. He snatched it off and read the contents. Apparently, his porch light was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. He shook his head. She wasn't wasting any time. The next morning, Elijah got to work. His first order of business was getting access to the HOA's records. He marched into the HOA office, a small, neglected building near the entrance of the neighborhood. Inside, the air smelled like stale coffee, and the filing cabinets were overflowing with disorganized paperwork. Mrs. Holloway, the HOA secretary, looked up from her desk, startled. She had always been quiet at meetings, rarely speaking unless Karren forced her to. Elijah didn't waste time. He explained that, as the new president, he needed to review all financial records, fine distributions, and resident complaints. Mrs. Holloway hesitated, glancing toward Karren's old office. She never let anyone see the full records, she admitted, lowering her voice. She kept a separate filing cabinet, locked. Elijah's jaw tightened. That was all the confirmation he needed. "Where's the key?" he asked. Mrs. Holloway sighed, opening a drawer and pulling out a small keyring. She handed it to him with a knowing look. "She's going to fight you on this," she warned. Elijah nodded, already expecting it. He took the keys and strode toward Karren's former office. The door creaked open, revealing a pristine space that was starkly different from the cluttered front office. Everything was meticulously arranged, from the color-coded binders to the perfectly aligned pens on the desk. But his attention went straight to the locked cabinet in the corner. He inserted the key, turning it with a faint click. The drawer slid open, revealing a stack of folders marked confidential. Elijah pulled out the top file, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the contents and his stomach twisted. It was worse than he thought. Karren had been issuing fines to residents, but instead of depositing them into the HOA's account, she had been redirecting a portion of the money into a personal account under the guise of administrative fees. She had been stealing from the entire neighborhood. Elijah took out his phone and snapped pictures of every document. He knew this needed to be handled carefully. If he exposed her too soon, she might try to cover her tracks. By the afternoon, he had compiled enough evidence to take action. He called an emergency HOA board meeting for the following evening. Karren showed up, her expression tight with feigned indifference. She took a seat at the long table, acting as if nothing had changed. "So, Elijah," she said, her tone saccharine, "what's this urgent meeting about?" "Trying to impress everyone with your new authority." Elijah ignored her baiting. He pulled out a stack of documents and laid them on the table. "These are financial records from the past 5 years," he said, his voice steady. "They show that fines collected from residents didn't all make it into the HOA's account." A murmur spread through the room. Karren's fingers twitched, but she kept her expression neutral. "That's a bold accusation," she said. "I don't know where you got those records, but I can assure you," Elijah cut her off. "I got them from the locked cabinet in your old office, the one you never let anyone access." Karren's mask cracked for a split second before she forced a smile. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "You're misinterpreting standard administrative fees, that's all." Elijah leaned forward. "Then explain why the funds were transferred to a personal bank account in your name." The room fell silent. Karren's face drained of color. She started, but no excuse came. Elijah turned to the rest of the board. "I move for an immediate vote to conduct a full audit and freeze all HOA funds until we finish the investigation." The board members exchanged glances before nodding. One by one, they raised their hands in agreement. Karren shot to her feet. "You can't do this. I ran this HOA for years. You have no idea what you're doing." Elijah met her glare with unwavering resolve. "That's where you're wrong, Karren," he said. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Cleaning up your mess." The meeting ended with Karren storming out, her face flushed with anger. But Elijah wasn't worried. She was finished. By the next morning, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. Residents were livid. Some demanded Karren return the stolen money. Others called for legal action. Elijah knew the fight wasn't quite over, but the hardest part was done. Karren no longer had control. And as he installed his brand new mailbox, one that was completely compliant, he couldn't help but smile. It had started with a petty act of vandalism. But in the end, Karren had destroyed herself. Elijah arrived at the HOA office early the next morning, stepping inside with a renewed sense of determination. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee, but today, it didn't bother him. Today, he was going to finish what he started. Mrs. Holloway was already at her desk, nervously adjusting her reading glasses as she glanced up at him. She was still cautious around him, as if unsure whether he would be any different from Karren. "I went through more records last night," Elijah said, setting his bag down. "It's worse than we thought." She hesitated before nodding. "What did you find?" Elijah pulled out the latest documents. She wasn't just skimming fines. She used HOA funds for personal expenses, landscaping for her own property, home repairs, even a vacation. Mrs. Holloway's eyes widened. "That's embezzlement." "Exactly." Elijah leaned forward. "I need a full audit on everything, down to the last cent." Mrs. Holloway exhaled sharply, then reached for her notepad. "I can start on that today." Just as Elijah was about to respond, the front door swung open with enough force to rattle the blinds. Karren stormed in, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She was dressed in an impeccably pressed blazer, as if she thought dressing the part would somehow restore her authority. "You have no right to be here," Karren snapped. Elijah didn't even blink. "I'm the HOA president. This is my office now." Her lips thinned. "You think you can just waltz in and change everything overnight? You don't know how this community works." Elijah folded his arms. "I know enough to see that you've been stealing from it." Karren's nostrils flared. "Those were legitimate expenses." "For what?" "A HOA business retreat at a 5-star resort." Elijah pulled out the document in question, laying it on the desk. "You used community funds to pay for personal luxuries. That's not just unethical, it's illegal," Karren scoffed. "You have no proof of wrongdoing." Elijah tapped the paper. "This is a bank statement. Your name is all over it." For the first time, Karren hesitated. Her fingers twitched at her sides, her carefully crafted composure cracking at the edges, but she quickly recovered, lifting her chin. "You won't get away with this. The board won't side with you." Elijah didn't even have to respond. The front door opened again, and 2 board members stepped inside, Mr. Patel and Linda Monroe. They were among the longest-serving members, both of whom had been subjected to Karren's manipulations for years. Linda wasted no time. "We saw the financial records," she said, "and we called an emergency meeting." Karren turned on her heels. "You can't, we already did," Mr. Patel interrupted, "and we voted unanimously to report this to the authorities." Karren's face went pale. "You're making a mistake." Elijah shook his head. "The only mistake was letting you run this place for so long." She took a step back, glancing between them as if searching for an escape. "You don't understand. I kept this HOA together. Without me, this neighborhood will fall apart." Linda crossed her arms. "No, Karren, without you, this neighborhood can finally move forward." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of years of resentment. Karren's breath hitched, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she turned sharply and marched toward the door. But before she reached it, Elijah spoke again. "One more thing." She stopped but didn't turn around. "You're banned from holding any HOA-related position effective immediately," he said. "And if you try to interfere with any HOA business, we'll take legal action." Karren's shoulders tensed, but she didn't say another word. She yanked the door open and stormed out, slamming it behind her. A long silence followed. Linda sighed. "That woman is insufferable." Mr. Patel nodded. "At least now, we can finally fix this mess." Elijah looked at the pile of documents on the desk. There was still a lot of work to do: an audit, legal proceedings, and rebuilding trust with the community. But for the first time since moving in, he felt like the neighborhood had a real chance at something better. He turned to Mrs. Holloway. "Let's get started." Elijah sat at his desk, sifting through the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated over the years under Karren's rule. The financial discrepancies were staggering. Each page revealed another underhanded maneuver, another instance of Karren siphoning funds or issuing baseless fines. He wasn't just looking at a case of mismanagement, this was outright fraud. Linda and Mr. Patel had already taken the first steps in reporting the matter to the authorities, but Elijah wanted to ensure that every resident understood the full extent of what had been happening. He drafted a detailed report outlining the most egregious violations, printed copies, and scheduled a community meeting for the weekend. When Saturday arrived, the turnout was even larger than the election night. The community center was packed, and the tension in the air was thick. Elijah stood at the front, holding the report in his hands. He scanned the room, seeing familiar faces, people who had lived under Karren's rule for years, who had been too afraid or too exhausted to fight back. He began by laying out the facts, presenting the evidence in a way that was clear and undeniable. He showed them the bank statements, the fraudulent expense reports, and the fabricated violation notices. With each revelation, the outrage in the room grew. A man near the front, a retired veteran named George, clenched his fists. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades and had been fined repeatedly for minor infractions. His voice was steady, but there was anger behind it. He wanted to know what came next. Elijah assured everyone that steps were already being taken. Legal action was in motion. The HOA's accounts were now under strict oversight, and moving forward, transparency would be the new standard. He promised that no decision would be made without community input. As the meeting wrapped up, people approached him one by one, offering their support. Some had stories of their own instances where Karren had overstepped, threatened, or manipulated them. Others simply wanted to thank him for taking action. By the time Elijah left the meeting, he knew they had turned a corner. Karren's grip on the community had been broken, and the neighborhood was finally ready to move forward. But he also knew Karren wasn't done. The next morning, Elijah stepped outside to find his driveway covered in paint. The words HOA traitor were scrawled in bright red across the pavement. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the message. He wasn't surprised Karren had lost her official power, but she wasn't above petty retaliation. He went back inside, checked his security camera footage, and sure enough, there she was. The grainy footage showed her sneaking onto his property in the dead of night, paint can in hand. She had been careful, wearing a hoodie to obscure her face, but it was unmistakably her. Elijah didn't hesitate. He forwarded the footage to the authorities, adding it to the growing case against her. He wasn't going to play her game. She wanted him to react, to get angry, to retaliate. Instead, he let the law handle it. By the afternoon, an officer knocked on Karren's door. She answered with a forced smile, but when they showed her the footage, her expression hardened. She tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. Elijah watched from his porch as the officer handed her a citation. She was seething, her hands clenched at her sides. When the officer left, she turned her glare toward Elijah. He met her gaze without a word, then calmly grabbed a hose and started washing the paint off his driveway. Karren stood there for a long moment, watching him. Then, without another word, she turned and slammed her door shut. Elijah knew it wasn't over, but it didn't matter. Karren could throw all the tantrums she wanted, he wasn't going anywhere, and neither was justice. Elijah woke up early the next morning, sipping his coffee as he watched the sun rise over the neighborhood. The air was cool, the sky streaked with soft shades of pink and orange. It should have been a peaceful morning, but his mind was already focused on the next steps. Karren may have been stripped of her title, but she wasn't done causing trouble. Her latest stunt with the driveway proved that much. He had already forwarded the security footage to the authorities, but he wasn't naive enough to think she would stop there. She had spent years controlling this community, and now that power had been ripped away from her. That kind of person didn't just fade quietly into the background. Elijah grabbed his phone and sent a message to Linda and Mr. Patel. They needed to meet. There was still too much damage left in Karren's wake, and they needed to act fast before she found another way to interfere. By mid-morning, he was sitting in the HOA office with Linda and Mr. Patel across from him. The small room smelled like dust and stale coffee, the old blinds casting narrow strips of light across the desk. Mrs. Holloway sat at her usual spot, flipping through financial records with a look of determination. Linda leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the table. She didn't waste time, she never did. "She's still got influence," she said. "I ran into Greg Thompson on my morning walk. He told me Karren's been calling residents, trying to turn them against you, telling them you're going to raise dues, change the bylaws, and worse." Elijah nodded. He had expected as much. Karren wasn't just a tyrant, she was an expert manipulator. Even without an official title, she still had her connections, still had people willing to listen to her. Mr. Patel adjusted his glasses, frowning. "We need to get ahead of her. She's already spreading misinformation. If we wait too long, she could convince enough people to challenge the new leadership." Elijah exhaled, thinking. "Then we put everything out in the open," he said. "Full transparency, we hold a town hall, lay out the financials, show them what she did." "We don't just tell them, we show them," Linda nodded. "They need to see the truth. Some people still don't believe she was stealing from them." Mrs. Holloway, who had been quietly organizing papers, finally spoke. "I found something else," she said, pushing a folder across the desk. "It's worse than we thought." Elijah opened the folder, scanning the documents. His stomach twisted. Karren hadn't just been skimming money from fines, she had been funneling HOA funds into fake maintenance projects. Payments had been made to companies that didn't exist, invoices signed off by her alone. Thousands of dollars had disappeared under the pretense of landscaping, road repairs, and community upgrades that never happened. He looked up, meeting Linda's sharp gaze. "This is enough to take her to court," Mr. Patel exhaled. "But will the residents back us?" Elijah closed the folder. "They will once they see the evidence." The town hall was scheduled for the following evening. Flyers were distributed, emails sent, and by the time the sun set, nearly the entire neighborhood had gathered at the community center. The tension in the air was thick, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. People whispered to one another, speculating about what was about to be revealed. Elijah stood at the front of the room, the projector casting a bright glow over the documents displayed on the screen behind him. Linda and Mr. Patel stood beside him, their expressions serious. He didn't waste time. He started with the financial records, walking the residents through each fraudulent transaction. He pointed out the fake companies, the missing funds, the fabricated fines. The room grew quieter with each revelation. People leaned forward in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Elijah didn't just speak, he showed them the proof. The bank statements, the invoices, even emails Karren had sent authorizing payments to companies that didn't exist. When he finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Then George, the retired veteran, stood. His voice was steady but filled with anger. "She stole from us," he said. "For years." Murmurs spread through the crowd, quickly turning into outrage. Some residents looked at one another, shame flickering in their eyes as they realized they had defended Karren for so long. Others were already demanding action. Then the doors burst open. Karren strode in, her face red with fury. She had clearly heard what was happening, and she wasn't about to let it go unanswered. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped, marching to the front. "You're twisting everything. Those funds were used for community improvements, real ones. You're just trying to turn everyone against me." Elijah didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, watching her unravel. "The proof is right in front of you," he said. "Are you saying these documents are fake?" Karren's mouth opened, then closed. She scanned the crowd, searching for support, but the faces staring back at her weren't on her side anymore. Too many people had seen the truth. A woman near the back, a mother of two, stood. "You fined me $300 because my kid left his bike in the driveway," she said. "And you pocketed that money." An older man spoke next. "You told us HOA funds were too tight to fix the community pool. But you had no problem paying yourself for fake projects." Karren's breathing grew uneven. She turned to Elijah, her composure slipping. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Running this HOA isn't easy, you'll see. You'll fail just like everyone else." Elijah held her gaze. "The difference is I'm not doing it for power, I'm doing it for the community." The crowd erupted into agreement. Karren's face twisted with rage, but she had lost. There was nothing left for her to hold on to. With a final glare, she spun on her heel and stormed out. The room burst into noise. People talked over one another, demanding action. Linda stepped forward, raising her hands for silence. "We'll be filing formal charges," she said. "And we'll make sure every cent she stole is accounted for." The residents cheered. Elijah exhaled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift from his shoulders. It wasn't over yet. There would be legal proceedings, financial audits, and a long road to rebuilding trust. But Karren was finished, and the neighborhood, for the first time in years, was finally free.